He thought the young girl who came to his door was just quiet. But that night, he realized she wasn't silent. The world just couldn't understand her language. She never spoke, never asked. She just touched. And after that, nothing was ever the same. The young woman the town tried to silence ended up teaching everyone just how powerful silence can really be. At that late hour, when the dust of the day was still hanging in the air, the open-air market was starting to empty out. The wooden stalls were covered in shadow, and the shouting of the merchants had faded into a tired silence. The dusty ground, cracked as if carrying the marks of old times, showed its age. People were slowly packing up, worn out from chasing the last sales of the day. But a group still remained. In front of an old barn, a crowd had fallen into a broken silence. Their eyes were fixed on one thing: a thin, battered mare standing behind the wire fence, her back streaked with marks of blood. But even she could only hold their attention for a few seconds. The real curiosity was the girl standing a few steps away from the horse. David walked over slowly. He pulled his hat down over his forehead and stared at the girl. He was 38, a man who lived alone and talked more to the land than to people. Normally, he didn't come to places this crowded. But that morning he'd set out for a few supplies, and on his way back, he'd noticed the mare. But now, his eyes had slid past the horse and landed on the girl. She was maybe 18, 19 at most. She wasn't wearing shoes. Her bare feet, coated in dust, seemed to be braving the cold. Her hair was stuck to her forehead, and there was neither fear nor tears on her face. Her gaze was blank, but steady. It was like she was watching something no one else could see. The man standing next to her, a guy with a dirty beard, a bottle in one hand and a rope in the other, shouted out, "She's mute. Might be deaf too, I don't know. But she's clean, cooks, doesn't talk back. Cheap." There were laughs. Some men snickered. One spat on the ground. David turned his face away. He didn't want to be part of this kind of deal. But just as he was about to turn away, something happened. The girl turned her head toward him. It wasn't a pleading look, not crying, not even hopeful. But it was strange. It was like she was silently saying something. Not to him, exactly, but straight into his eyes. David made a decision right there, something he hadn't planned. He turned to the man and took out his money. "I'll take them both," he said, without looking away. Laughter burst from the crowd. "You buying a horse or a slave?" someone mocked. But David didn't even hear them. As the man counted the money, he started to tug the rope tied to the girl's wrist. The girl instinctively pulled back, hiding behind David. David untied the rope and tossed it at the man. "No one's ever going to hold her rope again," he said, eyes gone dark. The girl didn't say a word. There was only a thin shawl on her shoulders. David led the horse out, and the girl followed silently behind. When they got to the wagon, David opened the back. The girl quietly climbed in, curling up in the corner. She wrapped her arms around her knees, like she was trying to disappear. As David climbed up front and grabbed the reins, he felt a light tug at the edge of his jacket. He looked down. A small, calloused hand was just barely touching his coat. There was no thank you, no fear. Just a touch. Maybe it meant, "Okay." Maybe it meant, "I trust you." David was a lonely man. He was used to living with the fences around his house, with the past he'd silenced over the years, with wounds whose names he never said out loud. But now there was a girl sitting quietly in his wagon. A girl who couldn't hear, who didn't speak. But those eyes. Yes, could this young girl be the only living soul who understood his loneliness? They set out on the road. As the wheels rolled over the hard ground, dust mixed with the darkness. Neither of them looked back. Only the sound of the wind kept them company. And in the coolness of the night, in the silence, something began. The first lines of a bond that had no name yet. The first lines of a story that hadn't yet been told. From the outside, David's farm looked plain and quiet. A weathered-roofed house, a few barns, and fences bent in the direction of the wind, all set in open grasslands that seemed to stretch into the horizon. That was enough for him. What more could a lonely man want? Silence, order, the land. That was his life, up until now. But that evening, when the wheels of the wagon stopped in front of the house, it was like everything was about to be rewritten. When the girl got out of the wagon, she looked around without saying a word. There was no fear or surprise on her face. She stepped as if she belonged here, as if she'd always known this farm. David opened the door and motioned for her to come in. She stepped over the threshold silently. Her feet were bare, but they didn't make a sound. It was like she was gliding through the room, light as air. They went into the kitchen. David tossed a few logs into the stove, breaking the silence with the sound of crackling wood. He pointed to some water that was almost boiling and then at the kettle. The girl jumped into action right away. She opened the cupboard, got out some mugs, added the water like she'd been living in this kitchen for years. Every move she made was intentional and careful, but never hesitant. Still, she didn't say a single word. It was as if she lived as someone whose voice didn't belong to her. After dinner, David pulled a piece of chalk out of a little wooden box. He pointed to the wooden frame next to the door in front of the girl. "Name," he said slowly, making sure his lips were easy to read. The girl paused for a moment. Then she knelt down and carefully started to write. The letters leaned a bit, but were readable. Sophie. David read it quietly. "Sophie," he said, and then again, "Sophie." The girl didn't react. But in that moment, it felt as if new life had been written on the walls of the house. And Sophie, without looking back, went straight outside toward the barn, into the darkness. David found her there in the morning. She was crouched next to the mare. The horse was still skinny, and the wound on her back leg looked bad. But Sophie was gently cleaning it with a cloth. She wasn't talking or signaling, but with her hands, her skin, her breath, it was as if she was speaking the horse's language. The mare was usually the type that would lash out at anyone who came close. But with Sophie's touch, she just trembled. David stood a step back, watching in amazement. A wordless communication, so clear and deep. That day David gave Sophie a few simple tasks. Wipe down the wooden floors, clean some old saddles in the barn, boil some water. She did everything without asking, without complaining, without rushing. But she still didn't say a word. After dinner, David left the chalk by the door again. This time, Sophie wrote a few small notes. "The dog is limping a little. The morning wind is dry. The horse feed is running low." It was as if she wasn't speaking because she didn't have a voice, but because she was the voice of silence itself. But that calm didn't last long. In the middle of the night, Sophie was the first to notice the noise coming from outside. When she woke up, David was still asleep. Sophie quietly went into his room and touched his arm. Her eyes were pointing to something. "What is it?" David said, still half asleep. Sophie just pointed at the sky. There was a look of fear in her eyes. David looked out the window. The stars were still visible. But something was different. The wind had changed direction, and there was a heaviness in the air that didn't belong to that night. Suddenly, the sky split open. The sound was more like the sky being torn than thunder. Then came the crash of a tree, the shaking ground, the animals screaming in panic. The girl had sensed it before it happened. She hadn't seen or heard it. She just knew. David quickly got dressed and rushed outside. One of the rotten beams above the barn was splitting. Sophie was already inside. She was leading the horses out, touching each one. David shouted, "Get out of there!" But she was still holding the last horse's reins. She dashed out at the last second, just as the roof of the barn came crashing down with a huge roar. Dust, splinters, and the smell of fire filled the air. Sophie wiped her face with her hands, but her eyes stayed fixed. David went up to her. "How did you know?" he asked. Sophie just pointed at her chest, then at the sky, as if she was saying, "I don't hear. I feel." That night, after the fire was out and the animals had calmed down, David sat at the kitchen table. Sophie sat across from him. She didn't write or make a sign, but for the first time, David didn't feel the absence of words at all. Because the girl sitting across from him was the only person who could understand the storm inside him without ever hearing the noise of the world. The days after the storm left a new kind of silence over the farm's land. But this silence wasn't out of fear or emptiness, it was a kind of acceptance mixed with awe. The old barn with the collapsed roof was a thing of the past now. Instead, David and Sophie had started building a new one together. Not a word was spoken as they moved things. Not a song was sung as they hammered in nails. But with every blow of the hammer, the bond between them grew deeper. That morning, as soon as David woke up, he noticed Sophie wasn't around. Worried, he went outside. Following the path, he finally found her crouched beside the sick cow in the corner of the field. The animal hadn't touched its morning feed. David had just figured it was a little cold, nothing serious. But Sophie didn't think so. She'd grabbed a handful of grass and was gently massaging the animal's belly in circles. Her eyes were steady. Her lips didn't move, but it felt like she was speaking a language no one could see. When David stepped closer, the cow lifted its head, then dropped it back down. Sophie didn't even turn around. And in that moment, a question popped into David's mind, one he'd never even asked himself before. Was this girl really deaf? Or did she just refuse to communicate the way the world does? Because even if she didn't hear, Sophie always knew everything. It was as if nature spoke to her on a different frequency. You didn't have to know the name of that frequency, you just had to listen. And Sophie listened with every cell in her body. That day, by evening, the animal gave birth. A healthy calf came into the world. David didn't say anything. He just stood in the corner of the barn, hands in his pockets, eyes on Sophie, but never voiced what he was thinking. Because, like everyone else who watched Sophie, he felt how words were simply not enough. But sadly, that bond wasn't met with just admiration from the outside. It was a small town, and news traveled fast. The first whisper came from the blacksmith's wife. "That girl, it's like she can read the animal's insides," she said, putting stale bread into a bag. "The village goat gave birth right after looking at her. That's not normal." Then the whispers turned into a rumor mill. "She looks into the cow's eyes and says they're sick. She noticed the kid's fever before his own mother did. She never talks because every time she does, something happens." The town loved filling in the gaps with their own stories. And Sophie's silence was so big, there was room for hundreds of misunderstandings inside it. At first, David didn't want to hear the gossip. When he came back to the farm, Sophie didn't even come out to greet him. But there was a single word written in chalk on the kitchen door: "I know." That was crushing, because Sophie never talked and rarely wrote. But now, with just that one word, with only that word, David felt a weight in his chest. One day when he stopped by the post office, two women were talking, not realizing he was there. It's a shame, he was a good man. Brought silent disaster home with his own hands. David didn't go in. He turned back down the side street. What he felt wasn't anger. It was more like a fragile helplessness. Because for the first time, staying silent in the face of a lie about someone hurt more than betrayal. That night, Sophie picked up the chalk again. This time she didn't ask anything. She quietly wrote on the wooden door, "If you need to send me away, I'll understand." David stood in front of that writing for a long time. Then he picked up the chalk and wrote a single sentence underneath. "But I haven't even begun to tell your story yet." The next morning in town, a little boy was burning with fever. The doctor was far away, and no one knew what to do. And everyone, even if they didn't want to, thought of Sophie. That day, without saying a word, Sophie went there. She touched the boy's forehead and closed her eyes. Then she took a bunch of dried leaves David had prepared at home. She made a mixture and handed it to the boy's mother. The boy woke up the next day. He was sweaty, but his fever was gone. His eyes were open. His mother cried. But the next day, while drawing water from the well, she whispered to the other women, "How did she know why my boy had a fever?" And that's when the real fear began. A quiet, cold, and unfathomable fear. That morning, the wind carried a strange humming through the farm's wooden fences. The sky was blue, but there was a heaviness in the air, like even the weather was warning that something was coming. David could sense this silence meant something different. Sophie was out behind the barn, gathering dried leaves from the grass, working without ever looking up. But she knew too. Sophie didn't listen for sounds, she understood vibrations. In that day, there was a restlessness beneath the ground. The first to arrive were 4 men. Among them were the town's old carpenter, the butcher's helper, and the blacksmith's son. Their footsteps were hard, their intentions clear. When they stopped at the door, David took the kettle off the stove, drew a deep breath, and went outside. For a moment, no one said anything. They just stood there, facing each other, hands in pockets. "We don't want her." The carpenter was the first to speak. His voice was steady despite his age. "This village used to be peaceful. Now the animals are scared, children can't sleep. People are uneasy." David replied without narrowing his eyes. "Have you seen her harm anyone?" "Harm doesn't have to be physical," said the butcher's helper. "One of my goats died. She petted it the day before. And the cow that was having trouble giving birth." Added another, "We lost the calf the day she was here." David didn't frown. He just thought of Sophie, kneeling by the animals, listening to them with patience. Her hair moving with the wind, and her quiet patience that never tried to persuade anyone. "What do you want?" he finally asked, his voice a little cracked. "Send her away," said the carpenter. Doesn't matter where or to whom. But she can't stay here. Even having her on your farm is dangerous. One day, someone will get burned, or someone else will get sick, and by then, it'll be too late. David took his hands out of his pockets. He curled his fingers, tilted his head. Sophie never burned anyone. But you've already lit the match. There was a silence. In that silence, Sophie peeked through the curtains from the window. Her face was in shadow, but her eyes were watching all of them. At that moment, some of the men in the crowd couldn't meet her gaze, because Sophie's silence was louder than all their shouting. The carpenter made one last move. "We'll judge you with her, David. If you don't agree, you'll be counted with her. Tomorrow, we'll be back with more." They left. Their footsteps sank into the mud. The earth didn't swallow them, but it kept their tracks. That night, David sat outside the house, his face in his hands. The loneliness he'd known as a child on his father's farm came crashing back over him, years later. But this time it was different. This time, someone else was inside. And that someone had left something on the table, a single sentence written in chalk. "If my staying puts you in danger, I can leave, but only if you say so." David stared at the writing for a long time. Then he went into the kitchen, picked up the chalk, and slowly wrote underneath, "If you leave, this place stops being a home." The next day, they really did come back in greater numbers. This time there were 8 of them, men and women both. They carried torches not yet lit, but just carrying them was enough to show their intentions. Before Sophie even saw them, David stepped out onto the doorstep. He recognized their silhouettes. All of them. People he'd sat beside at church, hauled hay with, even loaned money to. "We're not here to make trouble, just to talk," they said. "No," said David. "You didn't come to talk. You already made up your minds." The carpenter stepped forward. "This is our village. This is our history, our order. That girl is a stranger who's broken that order." And at that moment, Sophie stepped out the door. Her hands were at her sides, her gaze steady. There was no fear in her steps, no urge to run. She walked into the middle of them. In the shadow of the torches, without saying a word, she stood by David's side. Then she turned to the crowd. She slowly raised her hands. She didn't speak, but she made a gesture, like gently touching a small child's forehead. Quietly, then she pointed to the sky, then to her heart, then to the earth. No one understood, but everyone felt it. David stepped forward. "Sophie can't hear, but she understands. And she feels what this land needs more than any of you. She sees what you don't. And now, you want to silence her. Because her silence is louder than your noise." Some in the crowd lowered their heads, but some were still angry. Still, that day, the torches they carried never burned. They drifted away. Their footsteps were slow, but their thoughts even heavier. That night, Sophie and David sat quietly at the kitchen table. No words written, no signs made. But David placed his hand over Sophie's. Slowly, he laced his fingers with hers. And for the first time, silence truly became a home. The first winter wind rattled the roof tiles of the farm when Tom Weaver arrived from town. David saw him through the window. The wheels of his ragged old wagon were stuck in the mud, and he climbed down with one arm pressed to his chest. He'd broken his arm twice before, and no one had helped either time. Now he'd walked all the way to the farm using only one arm. He didn't knock. He just waited. David stepped outside, his eyes showing years of tiredness but a trace of pride, too. "What's going on, Tom?" David asked. Tom nodded toward the door. "I know she's here. My shoulder's out. The doctor hasn't been around in weeks. But, from what I've heard, that girl's hands can work miracles." David didn't answer. He just turned back inside and called for Sophie. When Sophie came out, Tom looked away. He wasn't looking at her like she was a stranger anymore. He looked down like an embarrassed child. Sophie didn't say anything. She just bowed her head and took his arm, inviting him inside. A short time later, Tom was sitting by the stove in the kitchen, sweat on his brow. Sophie wrapped his arm, turned an old herbal mix into a warm compress, and quietly pressed it to his shoulder. Tom flinched at first, instinctively. But then, something happened. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. David recognized that breath, the little sigh of relief that comes when pain gives way, that moment of gratitude that only silence brings. In that moment, what Sophie gave wasn't just treatment, it was understanding. A kind of trust that no doctor had ever given him. 2 days later, a woman from town showed up. She'd lost her husband 3 years ago, hadn't slept well since, living on her own. She didn't ask anything when she arrived. She just held out a wool scarf and a pear tart. She handed them to Sophie. "This is for you. When I stay near you, I shiver less," she said. Sophie didn't even look up. She just reached out and touched the woman's shoulder. The woman cried. Her tears were silent, just like Sophie. And then, everything changed. A child went missing. A 7-year-old, last seen playing in the henhouse early in the morning, nowhere to be found by noon. He was from a family that lived near the woods. The only thing they found was one of his little boots by the edge of the path in the trees. The whole town was up in arms. Men grabbed their guns, dogs were let loose. But everyone waited for Sophie. When David and Sophie heard the news, they jumped in the wagon. Sophie didn't say a word on the way. David didn't ask, because Sophie always said more without words. When they reached the place where the boot was found, Sophie knelt down. She felt the earth with her hands, lifted her nose to the air. Her eyes were closed, but it was like the whole world was whispering to her. Then, she made a gesture with her hands, a small, almost invisible direction, and she started to walk. David followed. Tom and a few others trailed behind. Sophie didn't say anything. She just walked. Through muddy trails, under the branches, across a creek bed. Every so often, she stopped, touched the ground, like she was listening to the earth's pulse. Then she walked again. Finally, in a small clearing, under a tree, the child was found. His ankle was twisted, his face muddy, but he was alive. And at that moment, someone in the crowd murmured, "She doesn't hear, but she feels." Sometimes more than we do. When they got back to town, nobody called Sophie a witch. Nobody feared her silence. Women quietly left cakes at the front door. Men dropped off hay bales and nodded their heads in greeting. And all through that winter, anyone who came to the farm fell silent first and then listened to Sophie. Not her words, but her hands, her way of walking, her touch. David never talked about any of this out loud. But every evening, as Sophie brought him a cup of hot tea in the kitchen, sitting quietly beside him by the fire, David felt just one thing. I built this house, but she brought it to life. And Sophie no longer wrote what people thought with chalk. Everything was clear in her eyes. Because through that winter, she never had to explain herself. Everyone spoke the same language now, the language of silence. The language understood by those who listen with their hearts. Spring came to the farm slowly, but with steady steps. The snow melted and mixed with the earth. Old cracks turned to mud, and the first green grass appeared behind the barn. Every morning, Sophie went out into the garden, touching the soil with her bare hands. David watched her from the window, the doorway, or sometimes just sitting beside her. He never said a word, just felt her presence. And that presence, which once filled the farm with silence, now wrapped it in a peace that was impossible to describe. David wasn't a lonely man anymore, but it wasn't just about sharing his loneliness. It was about seeing what's unseen together with someone else. And Sophie, she saw what no one else saw. She felt the sentences nobody ever said. Every morning, she'd write a single sentence in chalk on the board by the kitchen door. Just one sentence. Sometimes, the wind is gentle today. Other times, a baby will be born, I can feel it. And sometimes simply, today will be good. The people in town followed those notes now, because Sophie was rarely wrong. One morning, David took out a small box from the drawer. Inside was an old notebook, blue velvet covered, left from his mother. Tucked inside was a note he'd written years ago and forgotten, a few lines meant for a woman, but never given. Now, those words felt like they belonged to Sophie, because life works in strange ways. Sometimes the right words are written at the wrong time, but wait silently to reach the right person. That night, David gave Sophie a new note, written in his own hand. The sentence was short, but the feeling was huge. I hear you, even without your voice. Sophie stared at the note for a long time. Then she turned to David, and for the first time, with her own voice, her own lips, she whispered, "My voice was always in your heart." Her voice was fragile, gentle, like the way wind touches the leaves. But it was there. It was real. And in that moment, David realized nothing was missing in what Sophie didn't hear, because she was listening to the world from somewhere else, from the earth, from the silence, from the beating of hearts. As time passed, Sophie became a legend in the town, but a simple one, not an exaggerated story. The woman with no voice, but who hears everything. Children wrote her letters. The old folks sat by her side to share their troubles. Young girls came to her, wanting to share their own silences. Because Sophie wasn't an example, she was a mirror. Whatever was inside someone was reflected in her silence. David now woke up earlier every morning, brewed the tea, and left a small flower on the windowsill for Sophie. Like a quiet thank you. A ritual that spoke without words, but told everything. And every evening, they sat together on the wooden porch to watch the sunset. No words, but the world had never felt so full. One night, David picked up an old notebook and sat across from Sophie. He reached out his hand. "Teach me," he said, spreading his fingers. Sophie looked into his eyes, bowed her head, and placed her fingers on his. Slowly, in sign language, she showed him the letters, UNDRSDND. David repeated it, with his fingers, with his eyes, with his heart. A month later, in the heart of spring, Sophie wrote just 3 words on the board out on the porch. "I am here now." She drew a small heart underneath. Not childish, not flashy, just there, because she'd put down roots in that earth, because she had finally found where she belonged. When autumn came, the first gray strands appeared in Sophie's hair. David's beard was whiter, but his smile looked younger. The town's children would come to the farm on weekends, brush the horses with Sophie, tell David their stories in quiet voices. And sometimes, without making a sound, Sophie would give them a look. And that look was something a child would never forget. Years passed, but there was nothing left to tell. Because this story wasn't written to be told. It was written to be lived. So it never really ended. Every morning started with a new silence, and every evening ended with a new silence. And that silence turned into the loudest kind of love.